Oh my gosh.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I see that you all have food and are enjoying it, which is excellent. We have plenty of food, so if you get hungry again during the course of our lecture, feel free to grab some more, or grab some afterwards too. Yeah. I got my notes. Welcome today. On behalf of the Chester Awning Center, we'd like to welcome you again back to the Encouragement Lodge for another lecture. I am honored and truly delighted to introduce our visiting fellow today, Dr. Brian Doak. I first met Brian about 10 years ago in grad school. Certainly it's 10 years ago, actually. He was just beginning his PhD studies, and I was working towards my master's degree. At the time, we found ourselves in maybe the most harrowing seminar experience imaginable. In the first month of the course, we were required to learn the entire book of Exodus, 10 chapters a week, in Hebrew, of course. The prof would randomly call on a student, choose a random passage from the book, and the student was required to read aloud and comment on the features of the text, the vocabulary, the grammar, the syntax, etc. There were 6 or 7 students, as I remember it, and let's just say that none of us at the time was a stellar reader of this ancient language. Our seminar meetings were often tedious and painful. Literal tears were shed. Panic attacks were had, the stuff of academic legend. This is about as dramatic as academia gets, by the way. Right? Tears shed in grad school. Anyway, at least that's how I remember it. In reality, it probably wasn't all that bad, and it was a necessary rite of passage to becoming a scholar. Every PhD that I know has similar stories of their grad school experience. In the end, that dreadful but formative experience definitely had a positive effect. Brian went on to earn his PhD from Harvard with distinction in 2011, and since then he's accomplished as much or more than any scholar that I know, in both research and teaching. He is the author of 3 scholarly monographs. I have brought them for you here today. The Last of the Rephaim, Conquest and Cataclysm in the Heroic Ages of Ancient Israel, which is published by Harvard University Press. Consider Leviathan, Narratives of Nature and the Self in the Book of Job, which is published by Fortress Press. And most recently, Phoenician Aniconism and its Mediterranean and Ancient Near Eastern Contexts, published by the Society of Biblical Literature. And he has 2 more on the way in contract with Oxford University Press. So Brian is a prolific author and scholar, but he's not only a writer and a researcher. At George Fox University in Oregon, where he is Associate Professor of Biblical Studies, he serves as a faculty fellow in the William Penn Honors Program, where he reads biblical and classical literature with some of the best and brightest university students in the Pacific Northwest, challenging them to think deeply and critically about human history and life, with and through some of humanity's greatest literary works. So, as I already mentioned, his contributions as a scholar are much more than articles and books. He is also fighting the good fight, so to speak, shaping the educations of university students through rigorous teaching and reflection. Today, Brian is going to share with us some of his thinking about the Book of Job. The Book of Job, one of the richest in the Bible and in all of world literature, is full of natural imagery, and yet, surprisingly, very few have thought much about how that imagery functioned for the ancient readers of the book, and what it might mean for those of us contemplating the book now in our contemporary world. His book on this subject, which I mentioned a minute ago, has been called groundbreaking and remarkable by some of the foremost Job scholars in the world, so it is truly an honor to have him here today to share some of this with us. So again, I am delighted to introduce my good friend, Brian Doak.
Thank you for that introduction, Ian. That was wonderful. Can you all hear me? Does this work? Yeah? I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes or so, and we'll leave time at the end I'll read some things, but then I'll just kind of lapse into extemporaneous talking at points to try to break it up. Do you all have the handout? There's a green handout here, so I'll refer to that at points as well. The material here is indeed adapted from the book Consider Leviathan that Dr. Wilson held up. I brought a copy to donate to the Ronning Center or to anyone who wants to steal it afterward. I'll just leave it there. I won't even look, so you can do whatever you want. I'm also going to run the risk of not developing some ideas here today in the kind of full biblical scholarly sense that I might, assuming that not everyone here would be a biblical scholar. Instead, I'm going to try to give a full sweep of what I argued in the book, at least flashes. So, here we go. Okay. The question of nature's meaning or non-meaning is a loaded one, capable of eliciting ferocious responses, even tearing apart the moral and intellectual fabric of a society. Consider, for example, the 1755 Lisbon earthquake, an event powerfully analyzed by Susan Neiman in her 2004 book, Evil, an Alternative History of Philosophy. Now famous thinkers of that period, such as Kant, Voltaire, Rousseau, even Goethe as a 6-year-old boy, could all be counted among those agitated by the disaster, which in 10 minutes of intense shaking killed 30,000 people and threw Europe into panic about the goodness of God. The fact that the quake occurred as a major portion of the city's population sat faithfully in church, it was All Saints' Day, ensuring many would be crushed together in a place of worship, seems to magnify the problem for what we might call Theodicy. In other words, the task of trying to explain why, from a theological perspective, despite God's putative goodness, but also complete power, why horrible things happen in the world. As did the fact that the Royal Hospital of All Saints in Lisbon, which was Europe's largest public care institution at the time, burned to the ground with hundreds of helpless patients inside. Though wealthy and notable, mid-18th century Lisbon was by no means so notorious as to have deserved such a fate in the eyes of many. But its position in a period of massive intellectual ferment meant that the history of ideas was bound to be affected. Philosophers and natural scientists made a decisive split, in fact, in the quake's aftermath, as the physical earth itself acted out a drama whose results had come to fruition. The sentiment behind Job's sardonic cry, "What is man that thou shouldst magnify him?" could have easily been uttered there, as many wondered in new ways how God could possibly care enough about people to ruin their lives in such a way. The irony of Job's words here come from the fact that, as most agree, the author of Job seems to be citing an earlier use of a near-identical phrase in Psalm 8, where the poet there utters these exact same words to praise the goodness of God in light of nature's perfection. Should humans pillage the natural world for philosophical analogies, for statements of purpose, or for cues about the meaning of existence? In what sense? What kinds of analogies? It hardly seems adventurous to propose that nature will play an inevitable, ongoing role for questions of human meaning. There's no avoiding nature's effect on the structure of our thinking and our stories about ourselves. Indeed, whatever meaning nature implicitly has or does not have, there's no avoiding the narrativizing of nature. Though the sapiens act of Homo sapiens comes under frequent scrutiny, no one can doubt our identity as Homo narrans, the human storyteller. To the extent that the Bible serves as the great code, in Northrop Frye's memorable phrase, for the history of the West, the Bible's nature narrations have become canonical, whether as a normative and benevolent guiding spirit, or as an ignorant ghost raving in the background. Plants and animals are everywhere in the Hebrew Bible, and for obvious reasons. In non-industrial societies of all kinds, for almost everyone, the connection to rain, land, plant, and animal had to be constant, and it was obvious. Survival depended on it, as it does today, and the widespread participation at the ground level of agriculture guaranteed a certain kind of familiarity. Even though the notion that primitive man lived in earthy and beautiful symbiosis with the natural world is a romantic myth, it's easy for those of us, like me, perhaps like many of you who love the study of the past, to treasure earthy narratives of hunters and gatherers and village folk inhabiting austere landscapes while tending their animals, eventually returning home to close-knit tribes and reveries of mythical thinking and fire dances and frequent sex. In fact, ancient humans most often perceived nature as a fierce threat, capable not only of killing them through droughts or animal attacks, but also of implicating them in moral and religious stories that are lost to secular audiences in the contemporary world. In this talk, I'm going to examine the famous story of an ancient sufferer in the Bible, namely Job, specifically on the terms of the relationships that are forged or denied between the human self and nature. More than any other book in the Bible, as Dr. Wilson nicely mentioned, Job evokes a world of flourishing and dying plants and animals to speak of the human moral situation. In every distinct movement of Job, the narrator, human characters in dialogue, and the deity cast the key terms of their discussion upon the theater of ecology, a fact usually lost in debates about Job's meaning that focus on things like legal metaphors or the problem of theodicy generally. Put simply, I want to make two central arguments here today. First, I contend that the plant and animal metaphors constitute the primary terms of debate within the book. Okay. So I'll just skip all that. That's argument number one. And so I want to do a set of close readings of some texts, even on the handout, just kind of play with that a little bit today to talk about where I see this in the book. Second, I want to make an historical argument, as difficult as it may be, about how these images might have been received or why they were constructed in the first place, in a very particular historical setting, perhaps in the 6th or early 5th century BCE in ancient Israel. So I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. Broadening our scope to the entire Bible for a moment, is Israel's deity, the God of Israel, to be perceived as above or apart from nature, or somehow in it, or even implicated by it? Such questions have received a fair amount of attention from biblical scholars in the second half of the 20th century, spurred on by the influential work of a particular Old Testament scholar named Gerhard von Rad, who canonized a dichotomy between God and nature by making a distinction between Israel's putatively historically oriented worldview and the supposedly nature-oriented worldviews of the broader Mesopotamian world in which Israel was a part. In this view, creation and redemption have nothing to do with one another for Israel. Israel's religion, in von Rad's conception, was to be oriented around strict opposition to so-called Canaanite religious forms involving Baal and other deities that were thought to be part of nature. So they had their nature gods, we have our history god. Such nature religions were not to be opposed by the prophets or the Deuteronomistic historian on the basis of an Israelite view of nature or creation. Not like Israel came back with its own view of nature against this, but rather it just wasn't part of it at all. It was confronted on the basis of the history of redemption, Heilsgeschichte in the famous German theological term. Even materials that discuss both in the Bible, that discuss both nature and history of redemption side by side, according to von Rad, such as Psalms 136, Psalm 148, and a lot of other things, in fact, for von Rad, somehow managed to create a disjointed situation where nature and history were, quote, wholly unrelated to one another, unquote. One might simply ask how these themes can be truly and wholly unrelated while appearing in the same text, the same psalm, when presumably the author could have omitted one of them if they had wanted. When in the Psalms, creation does play a decisive role in characterizing God's being or activity, such as in Psalms 19 or 104 or in a lot of other places, it turns out, in von Rad's conception, that these psalms were considered Canaanitish or Egyptian in origin. So this type of move being one of the great deus ex machina of biblical scholarship. That is, if a theme doesn't fit your theory, then it's secondary or it's foreign in the historical accretion of the book. Themes of nature and creation are thus always epiphenomena in this way of thinking. Others, however, were more willing to tease out the manner in which Israel participated in myth and Mesopotamia constructed history. And the specific questions of the role of nature within the Hebrew Bible took on its own momentum. The past few decades have seen an explosion of this kind of literature, and so my project is hardly innovative in that sense. Okay. And by the way, in much of the literature, though, I would say that has focused on this question of nature in the Bible has focused, I would even say over-focused, on just one tiny little part of the Bible. You can probably guess what it is, namely Genesis chapter 1. Kind of the creation story is the site of almost like 98% of all nature analysis for the Bible. But there's a lot more, and that's only a very small part. So let's go to the handout for a second. Let's look at some of this. This is the more laid-back portion here. Okay, feel free to talk to your neighbor, get up, do what you need to do. Okay. I'll go back and forth like this. The first four texts there, from Genesis, from Deuteronomy, from Proverbs, and from Psalms, we can't read these all and discuss them all in detail right now, but I just want to mention them by way of saying these texts represent what I will call, for the purpose of this talk, the Bible's mainstream nature narrative. This is the mainstream nature narrative. This is the narrative that comes to mind. This is the one that's repeated most frequently in different places. The mainstream nature narrative goes like this. You are connected to nature, and nature responds to human righteousness. You are in control of nature with your righteousness. You're in control of animals and plants, But if you behave wickedly and badly, your nice tree in your yard, it's gonna wilt. Okay, it's gonna die. Your houseplants are gonna die if you're unrighteous. Again, for a secular audience, no, this has nothing to do with anything. Why would that be the case, right? But for almost all pre-modern groups, almost all non-secular Western intellectual groups, nature and states of human righteousness were seen as being connected to each other. Something many people in an environmental movement are trying to recover, albeit on different grounds. Take Genesis 1, for example, just the text there. It might be familiar to you. You can see the Hebrew words there that I have in parentheses, radah and kavash, rule over and subdue. These are very heavy words in Hebrew. These are hard words. These are words that are used elsewhere. I know that many people would like to take Genesis 1 and say, oh no, there's just an eco-friendly view of nature here. It's everybody, in a kind of beautiful, kind of Mother Earth setting. These words are words that are almost only elsewhere used in the Bible to talk about the relationship between masters and slaves. These are slavery terms, okay? But this is the extent to which the author of Genesis sees humans as in control of nature. You will control the animals. You will kavash them. You will radah them. You will rule over them in that way. That's the relationship that's set out there. Deuteronomy very classically says, hey everybody, you do the right thing, you can stay in your land and all your plants will grow. And if you don't, the earth will suck for you, everything will die, animals will rage against you, and you'll lose everything. Proverbs, same thing. I've got numerous texts there and you can read them later. Just take one. Honor the Lord with your wealth. This is 3:9 through 10. And from the first fruits of your produce. Then your storehouses will be filled with plenty. So in other words, it's an if-then relationship. You do the right thing religiously and you'll get crops that respond to you out of that relationship. Psalm 72, a wonderful psalm for this theme. A monarchic psalm which talks about the king, saying, if the king is righteous on the throne, what's going to happen? The fields are going to bloom with flowers and crops and food and all kinds of stuff. If the king is unrighteous, though, the implication, bad things. You think of say, 1 Kings chapter 17, when the prophet Elijah comes on the scene, he announces a drought against the northern king up there. This is for biblical scholars and people. This is a direct critique of the Baal worship of the northern kingdom and its supposed connection to fertility and their failure on this front. So these are seen as being very, very deep-seated, integral kinds of patterns to human life and behavior in the ancient world and in ancient Israel. Okay, that's what I'm calling the mainstream nature narrative. Okay. Now back to the book of Job. The book's eco-anthropological entanglements begin immediately in the first 3 verses. In fact, let's look back at the handout. Okay, back at the handout. Right in the middle of the page there, Job chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. This is the beginning of the book of Job. There once was a man in the land of Uz, Job his name. That man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and very many servants. This man was the greatest of all people in the East. Now, I would suggest here, along my theme, that the author of the book of Job is already toying with us on the terms of the Bible's mainstream nature narrative. What do you see being developed here? You see a man who's already said to be completely righteous. We're just told that. Are you supposed to question it? It's just rolled out right at you. And he has animals. A lot. I think we're supposed to think that this is a lot of animals, okay? Not just a few. And I think we're supposed to also think that this number of children that he has somehow is a magical number of kids, the 7 sons, the 3 daughters. And in fact, weirdly enough, do you notice how the 7 and 3 is a 10, and then all the animals are multiples of 10? He has 7 sons and 3 daughters, but then he also has 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels. Do you see the 7 and the 3? It's almost as though the kind of mystical pattern of human reproduction matches his righteousness, which matches the animals, and everything here is basically working in that mainstream nature narrative system. Things are working out, and we're left to wonder, as indeed the Satan character later in the book and God debate about, whether or not Job is righteous because he has the stuff, or whether he got the stuff because he was righteous. This becomes one of the key points of debate in the book. So when Job suffers, when his whole life is crushed, he then wonders, what did I do to lose my stuff? Okay, and thus he's in the fray. So already you see it there being set up in the book of Job. They're teasing us with this nature narrative. Animals act as a simple cipher for economic prosperity. Animals are under control in this prosperity dream world. They are in that sense anonymous and faceless, without personality or any qualities whatsoever. In order for one to conceive of material prosperity along traditional, proverbial, or Deuteronomistic lines, on biblical terms, animals would have to remain in this place, and humans, controllers of the moral drama, would master them as long as they, the humans, are righteous. In the Job and God scheme, however, this is later in the book, the animals will eventually provide living evidence of what it's like to live vulnerably on the edge of what one can take. The animals of the divine speech are not ideas, they're truly animals in dynamic relation to the suffering human. During the human-to-human dialogues that make up the bulk of the book, this is chapters 3 through 37 of the book, between Job and his friends, they're arguing about why he has suffered. Job doesn't know, neither do the friends. Plants and animals come up frequently in this debate, shockingly frequently, almost in every chapter actually. And the analogies here vary considerably. So let's go back to the handout and look at a couple of these in Job chapters 4 through 14. 4 through 14. So it starts off with one of his friends, Eliphaz here. Job 4, 8 through 11. And this one's programmatic for the kind of things we see. There's something simple, but there's something also difficult here. Job 4, 8 through 11, right in the middle of the handout. It is just as I have seen, this friend says to Job, the plowers of iniquity and sowers of trouble, they reap it. By the breath of Eloah, that's a fancy word for God, they perish, and from the wind of his anger they're consumed. The roar of the lion, the voice of another lion, but the teeth of the young lions are broken. The father lion perishes for lack of prey, and the sons of the lioness are scattered. This pattern repeats itself several times. I'll give another example, but it goes like this. The friends will offer what seems to be a very straightforward nature narrative. Did you catch that there? The plowers and the reapers, that's nature analogy. You plow something in, that's what you reap. You get what you sow. Boom. But then he comes back with this lion thing. I've wrestled with students in classes, and if we had more time today, we could all just sit here and have a big interpretive bash about what is this little lion thing here in verses 10 and 11. The roar of the lion, the voice of another lion. What in the world is he saying? There are many options here. So sometimes these nature metaphors are not exactly straightforward. They're ambiguous. Take also Job chapter 8, 2 down. Here another friend says, will papyrus sprout up where there is no marsh? Will reed grass flourish without water? I think you're supposed to say no to that. It won't, right? It'll be cut down. But then he says this in the second half. As for the freshly watered plant, it grows before the sun, and its shoots spread out in its garden. Its roots are tangled upon a heap. He sees its house of stones. If he swallows it up from its place, then he has deceived it. I didn't see you. So this is the pleasure of his way, and from the dust others sprout up afterward. That's kind of bizarre, right? Of the many different ways you could approach a text like that, it sounds like one interpretation, if my translation here is correct, these are all my own translations, they might be wrong in some key ways. It sounds like he's almost saying, sometimes a plant grows, but who's the he, by the way? Who's the he who sees it? And he deceives it and says, I didn't see you. Oops, sorry, I guess I crushed you. It can only be God, right? It's God who's the he who just suddenly uproots you and you don't know. But that metaphor is in fact opposed to the earlier one, which is the mainstream nature narrative one, which suggests that you kind of get what you pay for morally in nature. So many things are offered. It's not just one strategy. I raise these texts to say it's not just one strategy. Job himself comes back. Consider Job 12 there in the handout, 7 through 10. He says, I think this is supposed to be sarcastic, by the way. He says, by all means, ask the animals, and they will teach you, okay? The birds of the air, He's like, who doesn't know all this kind of stuff? In the middle of that text, by the way, in Job 12, I actually accidentally put in the quote something from my own paper there. Such injunctions may appear to set up in time. That's not in Job. That was a mistake. Sorry about that. This is how textual accretions happen in the ancient sort of tradition. Job 14, Job points not just to the nice ideas of nature. You water a plant and it grows. There you have it. No, he points to violence, violent nature. What about an earthquake? What about a flood? He says, what about a flood that wipes away the dust of the earth? This is at the bottom of the Job 14 passage. This is how you destroy the hope of humanity, Job says. I think he's talking to God. He's saying, nature can be reciprocal. There can be rewards, but not always. Sometimes it just ruins us. And why? Lisbon earthquake kind of stuff. So this is what you get in the middle of the book, a lot of this kind of thing. But on to the divine speech that closes the book of Job. Though the creatures Behemoth and Leviathan in chapters 40 and 41 understandably garner much of the attention here, I want to focus just for a change on some of the lesser discussed creatures. So I want to consider a few of these animal passages. And I've got them on the handout, and I'll just be reading and referring to them. So at the bottom of the first page, Job 39, those passages. And then on the top of the page on the flip side, there's another passage there. So that's what I'm talking about here. First, in 39, 1 through 4. The deity cites mountain goats. So God comes at this point, he's like, okay, fine, you want me to talk about this? I talk. He comes and he talks to the friends. God makes an appearance. First, in 39, 1 through 4, the deity cites mountain goats and deer as examples of animals that Job has not mastered. Amidst the potentially tender description of the mystery of animal birth, animals knowing the time of birth by instinct and crouching to deliver, accomplished without human assistance, prayers, midwives, or technology, the poet undercuts a straightforward analysis with a concluding line suggesting the mystery of lost children. Their children grow strong. They multiply in the open field. These are the children of the deer. They leave and they never come back, shuv, to their parents. The act of birth represents one pivotal transition. Things come through birth, through the birth canal, and change state. Birth is the beginning of life, but how does the animal parent know the time when such care will end, either through maturity or of the children or through death? Why might something like this resonate with the book's nature images? But in the first chapter of Job, of course, the key tragedy is not only that Job loses his animals, that's bad enough to lose your stuff, but in fact his entire brood of children are killed. Now all of a sudden you have a deity who's coming up and using animal metaphors and talking about the issue of animals being parents and animals having children and not being able to control the timing of the birth of these children or when they exit the earth. And that's a pretty loaded sort of thing to say at this point in the story, I think. The wild ass or the wild donkey serves as God's explicit example of an animal thriving in harsh lands away from cities. This animal is marked by freedom. Who set the wild ass free? Chopshi in Hebrew. Who loosed the bonds of the wild donkey? And this freedom specifically opposes the trappings of urban life. He laughs at the bustle of the city. He does not hear the sound of the shouting of the taskmaster. Rather, his territory is in the wild, the steppe, the salt land, and the mountains. He must find green things to eat, but he must search for them. Food provision is no act of righteous farming in this speech, but rather a function of the animal's free status in the wilderness. The term here, by the way, for the free ass's freedom, chopshi, appears only elsewhere in the Bible with reference to humans, and most notably, often as a technical term for a freed slave. I'm thinking of Exodus and the Covenant Code here and in other places. As it does several other times then, the divine speech takes a point of departure in Job's lament in chapter 3, when Job had wished for rest in the land of the dead, or the never even born. Job had said, small and great are there in this land of the dead, and the slave, the Eved, is chopshi, is free from his masters. The Lord's animal logic could refute Job's assertion since the wild ass possesses clear freedom in the land of the living. In order to acknowledge this state of living chopshi, however, Job would have to recognize a sphere of existence outside of his hedged-in success world, which he's lost. The manner in which the deity describes the wild ox also harks back to Job's domestic animal world in chapter 1. Is the wild ox willing to work as your slave? Such an animal would not eat at the keeper's feed crib, plow valleys, or submit to ropes. Two potentially archaic descriptions of God in the poems of Balaam and Moses, this is much earlier in the Bible, describe Israel's deity with this exact term, as a wild ox, who gores enemies, distinct from the generic tamed cattle of Job's peaceful existence in chapter 1. The wild ox in Job 39 is admittedly very strong, but its instincts actually prove, paradoxically, a liability for human use. If things are falling off the wall, that's a bad sign. If you cannot tie it down with ropes or keep it in a barn, then can you trust, the Job and God says, can you trust that it would return, shuv in Hebrew, and gather your seed to your threshing floor? Themes of return, shuv, this key word, now reverberate through the animal speeches, 3 other times as well. As Job is asked to consider the prospect of restoration as well as the pain of permanent exile. This notion of return is linked to trust or faith, raising the question of whether humans should expect or even hope for control over or restoration from the brokenness of their situations, in light of the animal world. My own favorite of these animal passages here involves the ostrich in chapter 39. This is the one on the back and the top, you can turn there. By the way, we get some images before we read about the ostrich. We could look at some pictures here. I forgot to talk about the pictures earlier. At the bottom, Do you see in the bottom in the center, there's like a guy in the middle there, some dude, and he looks like he's choking some birds there? Those are ostriches, actually. This was a known iconographic scene in the ancient Near Eastern world, the Master of Ostriches scene. So ostriches are pretty wild, they're hard to catch, they're hard to tame. They're sort of infamous for being animals that can never be tamed or really fully domesticated, ever. And so control over an ostrich is seen as one mark of human excellence over the animal world in this iconographic tradition. By the way, these pictures above, we don't have time to talk about all of them, but look at the one in the upper left-hand corner, that kind of intricate broken scene up there, and then the one directly to the right of it, the two top bigger images. These are images where elsewhere in the ancient Near East we find something very similar to what I was calling the Bible's mainstream nature narrative. The top left is this famous scene with the king Zimri-Lim in the old Babylonian period. He's kind of in the middle of the house there. He's in the middle in the square. He's sort of receiving some stuff, almost like a little stick or something like that, from a goddess. And notice how the natural world blooms to life around him. I think we're supposed to imagine this in movement. A bird flies up in the upper right-hand corner. These trees kind of grow up. Notice beneath his feet of the human characters, you have some water coming out of jars and flying all over the place. So the kind of the deeps of the earth, the well waters springing up at the exact moment when the righteous king receives the scepter of kingship. That's that Psalm 72 moment I was talking about. That's that mainstream narrative that says when human righteousness prevails, the gods are happy, everything springs into life, okay? And there's more we could talk about there. But back to the top of that same page, though, with the ostrich. I mean, listen to this poem about the ostrich. Thinking about those themes of return, of loss of children, and about this kind of the question of whether nature is friendly to humans or violent. The wings of the ostrich, God says, flutter jubilantly, even though she lacks pinions or the right kind of feathers for flying. So already, kind of a nature paradox. Why would there be an animal that has wings and it's all useless, just flapping around like this, and you can't do what you're supposed to do? She leaves her eggs on the ground, and upon the dust they grow warm. She forgets that a foot might crush them, or a beast of the field might trample them. She acts harshly against her sons as if they were not her own. Her labor is for nothing, but not to worry. Eloah, God, made her forget wisdom. He gave her no share of understanding. But another time comes, she rises up on the height. She laughs at horse and its rider. What a strange little poem, you know? I mean, think of the parenting metaphor here in light of Job's situation. It's incredibly dark, is it not? God is suggesting that he has in fact stunted nature at the point of its very body, to the point where this poor ostrich parent can just flap around all ignorantly and can't even protect her own children. But, you know, she doesn't worry about it. How does she respond to this? She just goes on to the next thing. She goes up and laughs at, you know, an image of strength, of warriors, the horse and the rider theme. She has no problem with this. It's almost as though the Job and God, in an incredibly harsh turn, I find this to be one of the harshest turns in all of world literature, seems to look at Job and say, what, you don't like my world? What's wrong with my world? Nothing's wrong with my world. Yeah, you lose your kids sometimes, you know. This is just nature. You gotta deal with it. Very harsh. Take one more example, also a bird. This is on the other sheet at the bottom. The final in the list on the handout. Robert Alter calls this one of the most unsentimental poetic treatments of the animal world in the Western tradition. This is this thing about the eagle on the bottom and the hawk. Is it by your wisdom that the hawk soars? This is the last text on the front side, bottom of it. And spreads its wings. Is it by your command that the eagle mounts up and makes its nest on high? It lives on the rock and makes its home in the fastness of the rocky crag. From there it spies the prey. Its eyes see it from far away. It's all very beautiful. And then this line. Its young ones suck up blood, and where the slain lot are, there it is. So in other words, animals survive by predation, eating blood. This is the natural world. Many more texts here could be discussed. I've mentioned enough here, though, to suggest that something serious seems to be going on. Something seems to be at stake. What do we learn about these animals and their relationship to other living things? The animal selves in Job 38 through 39 are certainly providers. Humans cannot provide for all animals, and in that sense, control over the order of movement and food, the world animal economy, is not part of the scheme of human existence for God in this passage. Animals find ways to become self-sufficient. They resist servitude. Desert animals live as alien creatures in strange lands, but they're survivors. The animals of the divine speech are, fascinatingly, given Job's initial family situation, their parents. They're reproducers who carry on in their own ways, despite problems. Their abilities are sometimes stunted at the level of their very bodies, at God's whim. One fears stretching the correspondence too far, but the connection among these themes with Job's initial dilemma, the loss of the animals, the loss of the children, as I've suggested, suggests that the human moral universe interacts with and can be compared to animal failures, negligence, and alienation in the book of Job. If this is true, however, then another possibility offers itself, again along the parallel of the animals in the book. Humans may also take up the power to survive in an alternate universe not unlike the wildest desert. In other words, Job's situation is fully within the purview of what is real. I'll conclude here with one following line of thought about, so what does this all mean? What is the Joban author doing? What's the upshot here? What are we supposed to take from this? During the era most suspected as being that of Job's authorship, in the century or two following the Babylonian destruction of the temple in 586 BCE, very much was at stake for Israel. Did the old covenantal structure still apply? How could it? But how could it not? Could Israel or Israel's God survive a disaster at all? In a world where traditional theodicies do not work, where the mainstream nature narrative falls apart, I suggest the author of the book of Job turned to deviant theodicies and accompanying deviant nature narratives, with the divine speeches functioning as a deviant, anti-Genesis, anti-Deuteronomic, and anti-proverbial nature narrative for a new Israel. Thus, the Joban self-making project has serious implications for thinking about the emergence of Judaism after the exile and the Bible's competing visions, their many visions, of the natural world. One specific, and to my knowledge, yet unexplored venue for exploring this line of thought is to consider Job's role as a foil to a certain kind of what we might call natural religion under terms set out by recent neuroscientific and anthropological research. I'm thinking here of the work of psychologist and neuroscientist Justin Barrett, who has discussed what he calls natural theology. That term has another meaning too in theology, but he's ignoring that, okay? Natural theology as a kind of basic human religious response, not uncontroversial, his thesis, characterized by orthodox traditional features such as the ideas that moral norms are unchangeable, that the natural world was designed in some obvious and clear manner, and that immoral behavior leads to misfortune and moral behavior to fortune, among other things. Natural ideas, he says. Such views may be described as cognitively optimal. They work together, they make sense as a system, and as we've already seen, however, various actors in Job, particularly Job and God himself, pointedly resist some of these core assumptions. They're heretics. They're out of step with the key components of natural religion as Barrett describes it. They are, to adapt the title of a recent book, theologically incorrect. Intense effort is required for those who wish to affirm theology outside of the bounds of this construct of natural religion. Cultural scaffolding must appear to buttress and reinforce counterintuitive ideas. So if you want someone to do something counterintuitive, you've got to really kind of build it up. The anthropologist Harvey Whitehouse has recently discussed the varying ways a religious group can inculcate and reinforce what he calls cognitively costly religion. That is, religion that runs hard against the grain of the type that Barrett called natural religion. Whitehouse contends that many religions have within them two distinct and even openly competing modes of religious expression. One he calls the doctrinal, and one the imagistic. The doctrinal mode is what many people perhaps would be familiar with when we think of religion. This is, often associated with literati and social elites. It's codified as a body of doctrines. Here are the rules. Here's what you do. Here's how you know what's right, all that kind of stuff. They produce, Whitehouse says, general knowledge and anonymous communities. They're diffuse. Their persuasion comes in the form of universal verbalized creeds, intellectual persuasion, that kind of thing. The imagistic mode, on the other hand, represents little traditions, right? And I love this phrase, what Whitehouse calls cults of the little community. Imagistic messages rely on terror, pain, and initiation. They evoke multivocal iconic imagery meant to produce cognitive shocks. In extreme but ethnographically documented cases, imagistic ritual can involve extended trance states, cannibalism, and even ritual murder. Emotions run very high. Imagistic ritual produces intense arousal, and expressions are infrequent. This isn't everyday kind of stuff, as opposed to the constant, measured nature of doctrinal expression. The sum effect of such a system is a body of what Whitehouse characterizes as elaborate, even if idiosyncratic, exegetical knowledge. And its attendant images evoke abundant inferences, producing a sense of multivalence and multivocality of religious imagery, experienced as personal and unmediated inspiration. The style of religion acquired through the imagistic approach is cognitively costly religion, Whitehouse says. It's unintuitive, flouting the cognitively optimal views passed on through human biology and straightforward everyday observation of the world. This basic distinction between doctrinal and imagistic modes will be familiar to the readers of the Book of Job. Whitehouse's research, I think, could breathe new terminological life into the framing of the drama. The Book of Job on these terms might be read as a textual icon of terror, of animal terror, a bold, imagistic attempt to freeze a moment in time where memory should remain fixated. It attempts to teach its audience through trauma. An audience watches Job as a participant in an imagistic ritual, where the initiator is God. Those looking for a take-home message or a central meaning to the ritual are perhaps, when we lapse into that, maybe we go into the doctrinal mode, no doubt preferred by biblical scholars for their penchant for systems and textuality and all that, and thus misunderstand the inevitable polyvalence of the imagistic mode. Still, even the imagistic ritual is meant to teach something, thus raising the question of what it is that the Book of Job is supposed to teach through its shock narrative. Here's my last suggestion on that front, and then I'll close. Something about the very nature of nature has changed for the Joban author from that mainstream nature narrative. And this ecological drama shines forth everywhere with pathos and possibility in the book. On the historical level of the book's composition and earliest reception, I suggest that Job should be read against the ecological backdrop of the exilic and early post-exilic period. This would be the 500s and 400s BCE, possibly the era of its authorship, although we don't know. In this context, the intense focus on plant and animal analogies makes eminent sense and reflects concerns expressed in a range of other products in the Bible from the same period. I'm thinking most notably of Haggai, who does a mainstream nature narrative about the rebuilding of the temple, second Isaiah, exploding with nature images, and perhaps even Deuteronomy. What archaeological evidence we have from this late 6th and early 5th century context in the newly reconstituted province of Yehud or Judah suggests not only a nation devastated organizationally or politically, but also a devastated ecology. And here I rely on the archaeology of someone like of Lipschitz and others, and Borowski and people who have done work in this exact period, in which usable land had shrunk down to a minimum, and the situation reverted to something much like what Israel's earliest settlers may have faced through the 13th through 11th centuries BC in their attempt to control the Rocky Highlands. Anyone who spoke of reciprocal or morally miraculous renewal of land in such uncertain times could only have sounded like Job's friends. Despite its putative focus on the individual, moreover, with Job standing radically apart from any community, we must notice the fact that the Book of Job is still deeply communal. Its struggle involves a community, writ small, of the friends in Job, the group of arguers there as a little government with their unfailing king, and their loyal but difficult subjects. This tiny kingdom in miniature represents and speaks to a small community in Yehud in this early post-exilic period. Though speculative, the connection of Job with this context gives the book's outburst of nature imagery a real-world home after the exile, and allows us to consider Job's radical theological trajectory against other traditional works as an expression of social and ecological crisis. To this end, then, I've suggested that the Book of Job function as a textual ritual of disorientation in order to inculcate its audience with a cognitively twisted message. Rewards do not inevitably follow from one's deeds, and the God of the universe participates in the construction of the paradoxes and violence of the natural world. To be sure, following what David Kleins identifies as a principle of the world for the Joban deity, there's no problem with the actual world. There's nothing that the Lord needs to set right within the terms of Job. That's the message there. Although other late wisdom works, such as Ecclesiastes, perhaps from the 4th century BC, would reduce the world to a desert, and the futility that comes when one's reward is totally unhitched from one's moral position, on the full force of its imagery, which I've just begun to suggest today, Job comes around to take us back into nature, to a planet of altered consequences, back into a world filled with teeming life, and back into the philosophical problems that nature creates and sustains. And I'll stop there. Thanks for listening and being a good audience to this.
So we have plenty of time for comments, feedback, questions for Dr. Doak.
Please.
My name is Theodicy. I'm a PhD in zoology, fish biology.
Wonderful.
And my question for you, I would really like to hear your opinion.
Yeah.
Is when me as zoologists reading this text from biological perspective,
Yeah.
everything that God says is biologically accurate. Now, I'm puzzled, and I think, what is the origin of that knowledge? In the time when it was written, there was no biology. So what's your opinion? Is the origin of that knowledge, when God speaks in John, is it divine or it's human knowledge? Maybe some forgotten science or something?
Yeah, thanks for that. It's a great question. It's beyond the bounds, I feel, of what I can even answer adequately. I will suggest this, though. Most people, and I did try to develop this in the book a little bit, along this idea of the cult of the little community and the kind of people that might write something like this. The group or the individual that wrote Job, biblical scholars are very hazy on these points. We just talk about redactors and editors and authors. We have no idea what we're talking about. Like, we don't know who wrote any of these things or when. It may very well have been a group that had a lot of intimate knowledge about whatever science existed at that time. In fact, for the book of Job, many have speculated that the author must have had very intimate knowledge of things like ancient mining practices in the ground. Job 28 is a mining poem, which has a bunch of weirdly specific references to mines. There are references to a lot of Egyptian mythology and literature. I mean, some people think, some of your question, it would seem to me, also depends on what kind of reading one gives to Job chapters 40 and 41 with this behemoth and this Leviathan. People have tried to identify these things with crocodiles or with whales and things like that. I like the crocodile idea there.
What about dinosaurs?
Yeah, for me, probably not dinosaurs. Although, funny enough, there's a book called The First Fossil Hunters by a classicist named Adrienne Mayor, and she says that. This is kind of a wild theory, but she's a good classicist. She says it could be that a lot of early Greek stories about monsters, like the Minotaur and stuff like that, had their inspiration in fossil finds that Greeks could actually see in some chalk cliffs near where they were. And so ancient people were actually correct in the sense, like there were these mythical beasts that lived in a bygone period. They were right about that. They may not have been the Minotaur or whatever they thought. I think that it's possible on a purely human level for authors to have written these things about animals and to have had this kind of knowledge. Obviously, though, for the faithful, I think what you see here is God speaking, right? So if God's speaking, God can say whatever God wants to say, about the animal world.
And it's scientifically correct, which is amazing.
Yeah, I agree that it is amazing, and the descriptions are really rich, so it's a good question. Sorry I can't answer it better than that. Thank you. Yeah, please.
You mentioned at the beginning some reinterpretation according to current ecological issues in the Bible. I may have missed it in your conclusion, but can you speak towards how your take of Job enters that debate?
I dodged that question in the book at the end. I try to conclude with like some kind of ambiguous note in the book saying something like, I don't know if we can find in Job a kind of program for ecological sustainability or care or anything like that. In fact, it might be that we find in our time that the natural world comes to save us or destroy us. I think of that, there was a popular article 3 years ago called The Great Cascadia Subduction Zone Earthquake That Will Destroy the Pacific Northwest, which is where I live. You're south of Seattle. Something like that, I think an event like that would actually be more conducive to thinking about Job, where I see the deity there in the book. I'm not trying to make a normative argument about whether you should believe the Job and God about those kinds of things, but I am suggesting that the view of nature there is something raw, it's something kind of savage, it's something brutal. Maybe the suggestion there is that, and I'm worried about it because as an ecologically conscious person, or at least someone who's trying to be, I don't want to promote messages such that I can even promote or deny anything that would seem to undercut efforts at, curbing climate change and all this kind of stuff, and just everything that comes with it. On the terms of the book of Job itself, it seems to suggest that nature is very resilient, though. That animals go about their business in a paradoxical world of savagery, of brutality, of predation, and that at any time we could be called to enter a world like that too, as Job was, with his own family situation, mutatis mutandis. That's a dark message, that's a bleak message, but that's what I think the book of Job, that's how I think the book of Job handles it, because every argument is against the friends and people who say, no, you just care for your plants and then you get what you deserve. Which I think is very much the language of the modern ecological movement, like we need to care for the earth and we'll get back results from that. I feel like the book of Job is just like a stark, weird bolt from the blue into that kind of thinking. Is there a place for it in terms of political action and those kinds of things? I don't know. There might be though. It might be something less like a position paper and more like an attitude about nature, which sees it as having its own integrity. And animals have their own lives apart from our zoos and our use of animals, our eating of animals, and things like that. In that sense, I think that the divine speech could be like a kind of charter message for a certain kind of ecological movement, which sees plant and animals as almost like humans, as selves, this language of self-making, and that they have integrity as such. So that's one idea. Does that make sense? Thanks for that. Please.
In the first chapter of Job, it seems so strange, the conversation between God and Satan, and using Job as just sort of a point.
Yeah.
What do you make of that?
Well, so in the beginning, so in case you haven't read Job very carefully recently, Job has all this stuff. He has a great life, and then this character, whom the Bible calls Hasatan. It's hard to know how to translate the word Hasatan. Proper nouns in Hebrew don't have the definite article ha in front of it. So it can't be that the author thought of it as a capital S, Satan, as the tradition would later understand it. But it could be, I mean, who knows? So you had that problem right off the bat. But this Satan, we'll call him Satan. The Satan character comes to God and says, hey, how you doing? And they're very chatty in the book, which is really weird. And God's like, hey, where have you been? And Satan says, oh, I've been walking around on the earth. And he says, oh, have you noticed my servant Job? He's great. And Satan says, oh, yeah, well, people are great when they have stuff. This is the classic narrative of privilege, He's got everything. How about we torture him a bit? And then we see. And God's like, okay, that sounds great. And then they do it. The typical ways that people have thought about that interaction, which seems totally creepy and problematic on a number of levels, would be that number one, that this Satan character is not the Satan of the Judeo-Christian tradition, mostly the Christian tradition, the pitchfork-wielding, horned king of hell character, but rather that this Satan is he's part of the divine court. He's a member of God's kind of family up there. They're all on the same team. That's not comforting in terms of the view of the deity, though, because it makes the deity seem as though, he's willing just to very, very easily sort of play dice with a person's life, even their own kids. Of course, whom among us who has experienced tragedy hasn't felt like that at times, even if it's not God, just the universe, it just seems random. Another option that people have seen, and in his most recent commentary, the longtime Princeton scholar, now he's at Vanderbilt, his name is Chun Liang Xiao, he writes in his commentary that, in fact, we should see this Hasatan character, as part of God's own self. That it's God's own inclination to hurt as well as to heal, which coexist within the deity. The deity encompasses all of it. So, a little bit more of a symbolic type interpretation of that. If, though, the character is, in response directly to your question, if it is the Satan of the Judeo-Christian tradition, that's a creepy scene. It makes God look like he's colluding with the devil to hurt people. These other two interpretations, though, I think better fit with the book naturally, especially the one where this Hasatan is a part of God's royal court. And there's a genuine kind of interaction there. How one then interprets it. Oh, by the way, a funny thing about the Satan you bring up, what happens to the Satan at the end of the book? What does God have to say? He addresses everything. Satan never appears at the end of the book. He's never addressed. It's as though he just disappeared or was never even there. So I think there's interpretive room there to suggest that somehow this whole drama was never even about that it was about something else. But, yeah, so it's a good question.
So do you see the Job then as being a big test of
Yeah, I mean, the book seems to be about, I think the book is about Job. And I think the book is about God at the end. So, not about Satan. That just kind of gets the ball rolling at the beginning. Otherwise, where did he go? Why doesn't he appear again? It's a good question. Yes?
Do you think that the real problem with Job is that he lost everything? Even though he said, God gave me everything, God took it from me.
Right.
He lost him his wife, though. Or the biggest problem was, Jesus on the cross asked God, why did you forsake me?
Mm-hmm.
And Job asked the same question. And he lost everything.
Yeah.
He didn't say, why did you do that to me? You gave me, you took it from me. And then later on, he was asking, maybe I'm wrong, he was asking all the time, God, why he turned his head from me.
Right.
And Hawaii saw all situation.
Right.
And he didn't mention any good that he did through his life before his friends started questioning him. And at the end, God didn't say, oh, Job was not right, God had something against his friends.
Right.
God didn't say anything against what Job.
Right.
Like what should.
Not only that, yeah, you're exactly right. And not only did God not say anything against Job, he did say that Job spoke of him what was right. He even affirmed him. But what had Job been saying, even in terms of the talk here, just to take one theme of many that we could talk about, what had Job been saying about God and about nature throughout the whole book? You pointed out the nice thing that Job said, God gave and he takes away, but he gives, and this is just the way it is. That's in chapter 1, chapter
But
2.
sir, he still had vision about resurrection,
Yeah.
He knew that there is something else.
Right. Well, so when God affirms Job at the end of the book, I mean, what had Job been saying though? He said the natural world is a violent disaster. God, you better come and answer for this. How dare you? Job 9 and 14 are the real chapters where Job says there's no good and bad. God is amoral. God has no moral distinction in the world between this is the kind of stuff that Job does say too, along with the other things that you're pointing out. So I guess I see Job as not just saying only the thing in chapters 1 and 2. You're not either, you're acknowledging that too. But he says a lot of other things as well. He is looking for something. He's looking for a day in court with God. He does get it, but then God overwhelms him with the nature scene, with the zoological lecture on the animals. So there must be something there. There must be something there for Job to consider about the independence of animals, about the way that he could think about loss in his own life. And yeah, as you point out, the last chapter of Job, then the final conclusion, he gets all the stuff back and he gets a whole new crop of kids, which sort of is odd because, like, if you say you had 10 kids and you lost 10 kids, to lose one would be more than I think I could bear. But to lose 10, but then to get another group of 10, like, are you supposed to think that then they're sort of replacement kids? Or, I mean, would you be satisfied with that? I don't know. But that is how the book ends, though, with Job receiving that back. Yeah.
And one more,
Please.
since I'm geologist,
Please.
he's biologist, my husband.
What a team.
Can we receive one book of yours with your signature about, you mentioned crocodile?
Oh, the crocodile. Yeah, so that's the Consider Leviathan book. That's where I have. But there's a lot of work that's been done on that, people going back and forth. But yes, totally. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Please.
The mainstream nature narrative that you were mentioning, probably missed it in your conclusion, but you said something about God had actually, the conclusion was that God actually is not that. Like, it doesn't, we're not to view it as that.
Right.
In the mainstream nature narrative. Is that,
In Job.
In Job, okay. Right.
I mean, I guess one suggestion here, which I probably take for granted as a biblical scholar and someone who works with these materials, which might not occur to anyone else or even care. Ian knows all about this too. Like, I think I typically assume that the Bible doesn't just have a single narrative on a lot of key points. That it offers multiple kinds of things. This is all the stuff about narrativizing and narrating nature. So the book of Job's nature narrative is not the mainstream one. It's not a common one. It's weird if you put it like I put it, and who knows, maybe I'm wrong about all of my points, right, about what I was saying. That's definitely possible. But if it is what I said it was, something deviant, something that's resistant, it suggests that at different times and in different places there's a different nature narrative. How one's supposed to know which nature narrative you're living in, that's a harder question. I don't know. The divine voice doesn't just boom it down, to me at least. But I think at least Job suggests on that front that there is another nature narrative, and that it's one that a community might have treasured and in fact needed at a particular point in the nation's history. So I guess that's a clearer. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for helping me to clarify that. I'm surprised how many people come out to these things. This is great. You guys have a great thing going on here. I congratulate Dr. Ian Wilson, too, as his new position as the director of the Chester Ronning Center going forward, and tenure-track assistant professor of religious studies. Very proud to be your friend, Ian, and congratulations, and thanks for organizing this. This is amazing.
Thank you again, Brian, for coming. Let's give him another. If you can't get enough of Bible talk, tomorrow Brian will be taking part in a panel that I've put together, which will consist of Brian and myself and several other Bible scholars from around Alberta from different institutional contexts. And we will be talking, each of us will share our thoughts on the problem, the issue, the role of the Bible in post-secondary ed today. And so all of us are coming from different institutional contexts, so I'm hoping that we'll all have kind of different things
things to say, and we'll be able to take part in some dialogue about what the role of the Bible is, shouldn't be in university education. So that's tomorrow at 2:15. Kind of a strange time, I know, but you know, lots going on campus today and tomorrow. But 2:15 in the Roger Epp room. We'll be up there for a couple hours plus, since there's a number of us. So I know people have busy schedules. If you can only come for 30 minutes, that's great. That's fine. Feel free to come and go when you can. You're welcome to come and go freely, and we will see you then.